Hope everyone's doing well. This is Ryan with TaylorMade Compounding. We have this January update to talk about a couple new products that we're working on and have been working on for quite a while. Most of this podcast or webinar will be mainly about the SS31. The SS31 is a really novel mitochondrial product, and we're going to be going into this with pretty big detail. Following it up, we're going to just reintroduce the NAD ionophoresis patches one more time, as well as the Epicatechin, just real briefly. And then at the very end, we'll give an update on Kisspeptin and a couple of the FDA compounding regulations and updates. For anyone who is wanting to not review the NAD, Epicatechin, or Kisspeptin, I would just recommend staying for the SS31 and really learning about that product because it's really extraordinary. And so getting right into it, one of the biggest things that we've been talking about over the past couple months has been, all the different hallmarks of aging, particularly this list, the primary hallmarks, the antagonistic hallmarks, and the integrative hallmarks. And one of the products, we've talked about a lot of these things. For instance, telomere attrition has been one of the things that's always been talked about, with products like TA65 or the Epicatechin, in terms of how do you activate those telomerase enzymes to protect those telomeres and prevent that Hayflick limit of division. We've always talked about genomic instability in terms of reducing your risk by not going out in the sun, reducing your exposure to different chemicals, which might promote any type of genomic alteration. We've talked about things like dysregulated nutrient sensing and then the fasting mimicking diet. We talked about cellular senescence a lot as we talk about things like the rapamycin, the FOXO4 DRI, and things of that nature. We've even talked about stem cell exhaustion as well. One of the things we haven't talked about, although we've talked a lot about its importance, is this mitochondrial dysfunction and how to address it. We've talked about a couple of peptides, such as the SS31. We've talked about some of the small molecules like the 5-amino-1-MQ and how that works with the mitochondria. But I really want to focus today on a particular peptide, the SS31 for mitochondrial dysfunction. And before we go into it, I really want to just go over real quickly mitochondrial aging. Mitochondrial age is important because we have dysregulation of our mitochondria as we get older. The role of mitochondria in aging was first proposed more than 40 years ago by Dr. Harman, who basically suggested that intracellular damage of the mitochondria actually increased as we got older because of their ability, or I should say their proximity to all these reactive oxygen species. And that reactive oxygen species in the mitochondria could actually function as an aging clock. Since then, we've shown that the mitochondrial dysfunction contributes to aging in multiple organ systems, multiple tissues, as well as multiple animals. And so really investigating why the mitochondria age and what we can do about it is sort of vastly important. As we age, this dysfunction sort of takes part, or I should say manifests itself in a lot of different ways. For instance, we have a decline in substrate availability, so the mitochondria has less fuel to do its job. We see uncoupling between oxygen consumption and ATP production, so our ATP production actually goes down, and we have reduced oxidative phosphorylation. We see increase in electron leak, reactive oxygen species. We see more oxidative damage, like the original theory in terms of our mitochondrial DNA can mutate. We can get reduced, or I should say abnormal expression of different proteins or lipids, and then we can have a decrease in enzymatic activities. And so these are all the things that happen, but the real question is how do we get there and how can we prevent it? A lot of people think that one of the major causes of mitochondrial dysfunction is changes in the mitochondrial DNA. So as everyone knows, the mitochondria has its own set of DNA that's passed down from the maternal line. And there's been, I would say, a lot of evidence that shows that that these causative roles of the DNA mutations in aging are the reason why we get some of these aging phenotypes. I've mentioned this right here where mitochondrial DNA mutations in aging comes from a study of mitochondrial DNA in mutator mice that express a proofreading deficient version of these mitochondrial, polymerase. And the accumulation of these mutations manifest in the mice having a really, really accelerated aging phenotype. So this might be one of the reasons. However, although the accumulation of somatic mitochondrial DNA mutations has been implicated, there are multiple conflicting reports raising controversy about this. Mitochondrial DNA exists in multiple copies per cell, and based on the phenotypic expression, it doesn't look like there's enough mitochondrial changes to really have the effect that it does on the phenotype of aging. And this is really one of the reasons that there's a lot of skepticism about this particular cause. The next sort of thought is that there's a lot of free radicals, and we talked about this in the very, very beginning, and the imbalance between excessive reactive oxygen species and limited antioxidant defense leads to oxidative stress, and this oxidative stress causes an inhibition of mitochondrial function, and therefore is the reason a lot of people think that the mitochondria don't work as we age. And all these findings suggest a tight link between reactive oxygen species generation and oxidative damage. We actually don't know if the reactive oxygen species is a cause or a consequence of aging. And so a lot of studies recently have shown that, actually a little bit of reactive oxygen species in the mitochondria is a good thing. We think about, how some types of stress are actually a good thing, like, some types of fasting or, exposure to heat and cold. All these things have a little bit of stress, which our body is able to mount a response to. And this response actually can increase longevity. And so together, these findings sort of implicate that increased reactive oxygen species generation or oxidative stress is probably not the initial cause, but rather a consequence of aging. And so again, this is only a piece of the puzzle. Going forward, you also want to think about mitochondrial dynamics. Mitochondria are pretty highly regulated structures that undergo fission and fusion processes that shape their morphology, regulation of their size, number, and sort of where they're located. And mitochondrial dynamics have been strongly implicated to aging and age-related diseases. For instance, it's been documented that aging is characterized by a progressive decline in a protein called MFN2 in skeletal muscle, which promotes mitochondrial dysfunction and underlies things like metabolic homeostasis as well as sarcopenia. And so this fusion and fission process is really, really interesting and might be a reason that we also have mitochondrial dysfunction. Mitochondrial fusion is essential for maintaining mitochondrial membrane potential, ATP production, and maximum respiratory capacity. Unopposed fusion generates sort of a network of hyperfused mitochondria associated with increased ATP production, reduced reactive oxygen species, and ability to sort of counteract those metabolic insults and protect against autophagy as well as apoptosis. And so this is sort of obviously what you want, but you don't want it in too much. And so this is another thing to consider in terms of regulating the mitochondria. The last part of the mitochondria that might sort of cause this aging dysfunction is, again, this mitophagy versus mitochondrial biogenesis. The damage from dysfunctional mitochondria is selectively degraded by the mitochondria-specific autophagy clearance process known as mitophagy, where new mitochondria are synthesized, whereas new mitochondria are synthesized by mitochondrial biogenesis. So just like this merging process, this fusion and fission, you also have a process called mitochondrial biogenesis, where you have the mitophagy process where mitochondria are breaking down for some of their constituents. A decline in both of these mitophagy and autophagy pathways are associated with aging and a variety of age-related pathologies, such as neurodegenerative disease, cardiac and immune system disorders, hepatic dysfunction, kidney failure, and even cancer. And we know that in some animal systems, for instance, age-dependent decline in mitophagy in C. elegans, which is this yeast, was shown, or in this these worm studies, were actually shown to prevent clearance of dysfunctional mitochondria and mitochondrial biogenesis, resulting in the accrual of mitochondrial damage with deterioration of cellular function. So these are sort of all three ways which you can contribute to mitochondrial dysfunction. We're not sure which of these is the predominant one as we age, but we also know that we need to counteract a lot of these things. And so this is sort of what happens. The mitochondria communicate changes in their function and metabolic state to the nucleus through activation of retrograde signaling pathways in response to a lot of the cues that they get. This retrograde signaling pathway is an adaptive response that coordinates basically the genome, our genome to the mitochondrial genome for expression. And so It's definitely really interesting. Many studies reported that mild respiratory chain impairment leads to low levels of reactive oxygen species, can induce this sort of response called metoremesis. And this has been shown to extend lifespan and promote animal health in a variety of organisms. And that another reason that this can happen is because of this activation of the UPR. The UPR is actually stands for unfolded protein response, and so it's sort of the proteomic, I should say, negative pathway. So whenever mitochondrial stress occurs due to accumulated or unfolded proteins, or misfolded or unassembled proteins, it elicits a retrograde signaling that induces nuclear transcription factors, resulting in the induction of things like heat shock proteins or chaperone proteins. And so there are a lot of different ways that the mitochondrial dysfunction can affect the rest of the body, mainly deleting, deteriorating stem cell function, reducing cellular senescence, and activating some of these other pathways. So the current approaches is, how do we fix this? Typically current approaches really revolve around improving mitochondrial ATP production is generally through alpha lipoic acid or acetyl L-carnitine, or even cofactors like NAD, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and reducing, obviously, oxidative stress. And so for anyone who knows, NAD is obviously the central metabolic cofactor that plays a critical role in regulating a lot of this mitochondrial bioenergetics. And in its reduced form is the main cofactor for the electron transport chain. And we obviously know that NAD is markedly reduced with age, and that supplementing NAD can actually improve a lot of these age-related phenotypes in mice, and it's starting to be proven to reduce a lot of these age-related phenotypes in humans as well. Another current approach has been not just to fix ATP production, but also to fix or sort of address this free radical theory. And this mitochondrial free radical theory is usually addressed by MitoQ or SKQ as sort of anti-aging agents. And many people are probably familiar with this. And, the MitoQ has been reported to extend lifespan and the C. elegans model as well in Alzheimer's disease. And obviously chronic supplementation has been proven to reduce aortic stiffening in old mice and improve vascular function in older adults. And so while these can actually reduce oxidative stress, there's no evidence that they actually improve ATP production in aged individuals or animals. And so we really need a way to particularly address how to increase ATP production. And again, despite the many approaches, none have been directly targeted to the electron transport chain to improve coupling efficiency or increase ATP production. And so that really brings us to an interesting protein that's expressed in the inner mitochondrial membrane, which is called cardiolipin. So cardiolipin is a phospholipid only found in the mitochondria, and particularly in high levels in the inner mitochondrial membrane. And it's actually where it's produced. The specific fatty acids on cardiolipin are tissue specific. So in high energy tissues like the heart, it contains a lot of linoleic acid, as well as in the brain, it contains a lot more different fatty acid compositions. What we do know is that cardiolipin is really responsible for the bins of the cister mitochondria, and that it's actually an essential function because it can regulate that structure, which maximizes the ability to maximize the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. And this is really, really important for mitochondrial function in ATP production. So really, cardiolipin is considered to function as the glue that stabilizes the proteins of the electron transport chain. But as we age, it becomes really, really dysfunctional. One of the reasons it can is because it becomes oxidized. And whenever the oxidation of this cardiolipin, you sort of have mitochondria that lose its curved structure. And therefore, you can have a destabilization of respiratory supercomplexes. And then in addition to that, you also have fatty acid composition changes with age. So the cardiolipin starts to have, not the same function and structure in the tissues that it should. For instance, in the heart, it might have less of that, linoleic acid. And in other tissues, it actually might have more of other types of acids. So as these changes occur as we age, we see reduced membrane fluidity and reduced ATP production, particularly in the brain, heart, and skeletal muscle. Which brings us to sort of the SS31. These are called unfortunately, Hazel Setu, I think, and Dr. Schiller are the two doctors at Cornell who created these tetrapeptides, and they did it completely by surprise. But the SS31 and SS20 are essentially 4 amino acid peptide products, which are essentially cloaked. So they're able to move within these phospholipid membranes and actually go straight into the inner mitochondrial membrane where they actually collect. And so subsequent studies have revealed that the SS peptides interact selectively with cardiolipin on that membrane, and you can see it in some of these pictures. In particular, this one shows cardiolipin density in some of these curvatures, the dark area there. The binding of SS peptides to cardiolipin on the membrane is likely to increase this lipid packing and induces these tighter curvatures. Really has not been, at the moment, demonstrated experimentally, but that's what it's thought to do. So once the SS peptides bind to this cardiolipin on the inner mitochondrial membrane, they're able to promote electron flux and electron transport chain. So through all of this, they're able to essentially make sure that the electron transport chain is, through proximity, maximizing the way that it does its job. So all these components of the electron transport chain, all 5 components, are linked together to maximize efficiency. And this is incredibly important because it fixes a lot of the changes that we see as we age in the mitochondria, and is able to reverse a lot of the changes we see with age. One of the biggest things that they found was that it was able to rejuvenate oxidative phosphorylation in aged skeletal muscle. So reduced exercise tolerance in humans and mice has been associated with reduced bioenergetics and metabolism in skeletal muscle. And a lot of the reasons for this is because of reduced capacity for the mitochondria to perform oxidative phosphorylation and do its job. That's backed up by the fact that a lot of muscle biopsies in older individuals show increased oxidative damage, as well as lower mitochondria DNA content, which means that the mitochondria isn't replicating as much. This is obviously a key enzyme that is essentially reduced as we age, meaning that we get reduced ATP production, reduced oxygen, and reduced ability to really handle a lot of metabolic stress as well. So it was quite surprising whenever there was a study that reported that a single treatment of SS31 in aged mice rapidly reversed the cognitive decline in mitochondrial function. So even just with one injection, they saw that SS was taken up through skeletal muscle with maximal levels being 30 minutes after subcutaneous administration. And then maximal ATP production was seen with in 5-month-old mice 1 hour after treatment. And so they were able to really change their bioenergetics back to that of young mice with just a single injection. And treatment with SS31 for 8 days significantly improved endurance capacity in aged mice. The immediate improvement in mitochondrial function suggested it's not due to turnover of oxidative damaged proteins or lipids, but most likely explained by the fact that SS31 is able to bind cardiolipin and promote that electron transfer, in the electron transport chain. A recent clinical study also confirmed that SS31 can significantly increase skeletal muscle maximum ATP production in elderly individuals. Remarkably, the increase in ATP production is achieved with just one dose compared to what can actually be achieved in 6 months of endurance training. Even 6 months of training is not able to match the effects of one injection of this SS31, which is pretty astounding. As we look at the other clinical trials which have been done on the SS31, we see a variety of really exciting literature and research. The SS31, because of what it can do in terms of maximizing the electron transport chain, doesn't just increase, skeletal muscle or increase endurance capacity. What it also does is helps protect cells which are, undergoing premature apoptosis, in the event of disease. It protects cells which are undergoing senescence. It does a lot of different things, and so this is sort of a collection of all these different things that I wanted to talk about, because it almost sounds too good to be true. Almost like the BPC 157, which has studies in a variety of different instances with little to no side effects. This is very, very similar. We see SS31 showing reversal of visual decline in mouse models of diabetes. We see it protecting against atherosclerosis in in aged mice. You see it helping with heart failure or heart disease. You see increased, wound healing whenever you administer this product. You even see that it's protective in TBI and stroke. One of the ways that it does that is it actually enhances BDNF signaling and synaptic plasticity, which provides, sort of protective effects on cognitive function, and has actually been shown to help improve cognitive function in elderly people as well. And some people are even using it, as the study in the bottom left shows, as a way to protect elderly individuals from the effects of anesthesia. And so there are a lot of different applications for this. On the top right, we see that it might be able to be used for ALS. We see that it might do quite a few things. Just to mimic that, I wanted to even put another model here where we see, again, it helps with ejection fraction of the heart. It might help promote, help fix some of the mitochondrial dysfunction and metabolic dysfunction seen with diabetes. It helps with immediately after injury and in terms of cartilage injury to prevent apoptosis. It reverses age-related redox stress and improves exercise tolerance. It can be used to help protect your eyes in glaucoma or the nerves in glaucoma. And again, it can really help with a variety of things, but also is just an amazing product as we age to maximize the efficiency of oxidative phosphorylation and the electron transport chain. And this is a product that has just a plethora of clinical applications as well. And as a result, you see a ton of different studies. These are all the ones that were currently out as of 2017. There are many that have been finished or even started in addition to this. One of the things I didn't mention in terms of its application was also in preventing renal damage or helping with patients with low EGFRs. And so this is a product which can be used in just about every patient, whether they're having, myopathy, heart failure, macular degeneration, neuropathy, stenosis. It even prevents foam cells from infiltrating the endothelium. It can sort of, in animal models, is sort of shown to reverse a lot of those markers of endothelial and cardiovascular disease. And so it's got just an absolute, overwhelming amount of clinical application. And has been shown in a variety of models. Those were just the human studies. As we talk about dosing, this is unfortunately one that is not currently out yet for us. We will probably have this in around 3 weeks, but due to the demand, we definitely wanted to let people know and understand a little bit more about this product before they were sort of marketing it and using it in their patients. And so there are many ways to dose this one. And most of the clinical trials has been done as a 4-hour IV infusion at 3 different doses, with actually the highest dose, the 0.25 milligram per kilogram per hour, being the most effective. I will say though that most studies now are done as a 40 milligram daily subcutaneous injection, and many people are doing this anywhere from 8 to 12 weeks and doing it once or twice a year. In some of these particular glaucoma studies or these diabetic eye studies, they've been doing this as a 1% topical ophthalmic solution. The other thing is we tend to look at it is that there are essentially not a lot of side effects. Headache and dizziness being by far the 2 most common, but they also happened in placebo at similar I should say incidence rates. And so there wasn't a lot here to be worried about in all the clinical trials. The biggest thing just has to go to dose and cost to efficacy. This tends to be a relatively expensive product. And so as a result, it can be difficult to continue for that long. Many adapted protocols have been generally 500 micrograms every day or 1 milligram every other day in order to significantly reduce that cost. And so the SS31, just as a summary, is really a product which, again, goes to that inner mitochondrial membrane, stabilizes the structure of those cysti via an interaction with cardiolipin, which protects the mitochondria from aging, maximizes its ability to produce ATP, and therefore can counteract a lot of the aging disorders that you see in the mitochondria. And this is important in a variety of disease processes, and as well as prevention and anti-aging. So one of the big areas we also want to go is sort of NAD administration. A lot of people talk about NAD administration as it relates to NAD as well as NMN. You know, NMN and nicotinamide riboside are these precursors which go to NAD, and I think it's always important to look at the NAD pathway and all the ways it works, and all the things that it contributes to. It works on as a cofactor for CD38 for these poly-ADP ribose polymerases, or PARPs, as well as the NAD-dependent acetylases, or the sirtuins. And so, again, NAD is a cofactor which is needed by a lot of tissues, which significantly reduces as we age. And as we talked about earlier, you know, the NADH is one of the primary essentially reagents needed to complete the electron transport chain. So this is really, really important to address as we age, as many of you know. We've talked already about how NMN and nicotinamide riboside can be oral versions of this therapy, but a lot of people also like to treat, you know, this aging or type 2 diabetes or obesity, or, you know, any type of ischemia or Alzheimer's disease with some of this NAD. And so obviously the precursors are really exciting, but I also want to talk, and this just is an image which goes to the NAD decrease and the increase of CD38, which might show the mechanism. Since CD38 is highly expressed in inflammatory cells, it's possible that sort of chronic low-grade inflammation may actually lead to the overexpression of CD38, which sort of results in that increase of CD38 and the decrease of NAD. And, you know, a lot of people think that might happen as a result of senescence, but regardless of how it happens, it definitely needs to be treated. One of the ways you can treat it is maybe by including some of those senolytics, which might reduce that inflammatory burden, but another is through just exogenous administration of NAD. A lot of people know that exogenous administration of NAD at this point has been limited to just the precursors, NMN or nicotinamide riboside via the oral route, with nicotinamide riboside having, I would say, a lot more data. As we get into NAD exogenously, this also doesn't have much data, but most people in the integrative space, the cash pay medicine space, have been doing this via IV at high doses, you know, marketing it usually as like a brain reboot or to help treat drug addiction. I won't sort of speculate on those types of things, but I will say that, you know, obviously subcutaneous injections and IVs can have you know, a lot of side effects in terms of, you know, it might be induce brain fog, it might induce, you know, GI distress or nausea, and for some people might induce some, you know, some dizziness or, you know, flushing of the skin. And so whenever you're looking at other ways to address this, I also want to bring up these NAD electrophoresis or ionophoresis. These are patches which use an electrical gradient to drive NAD through the skin. First and foremost, I should note that there's been no clinical research on this yet in terms of how this affects NAD levels in the blood. And there's a lot of speculation on that NAD in the blood testing, because lysis of red blood cells can contribute to really, I guess, a highly inaccurate levels of NAD. And so this is, though, being done. It's being done by a couple researchers who are now studying the ionophoresis patches, as well as IV subcutaneous and some of these oral administrations as well, to quantify how much the NAD levels change in blood. And so all of these things are definitely exciting, but this is one that we've done relatively recently. What we recommend is sort of using these ionophoresis patches over the course of 4 hours, which is how long the battery lasts, and using essentially 400 milligrams per ml, so a total of 800 milligrams applied to the reservoir of the patch, and then doing that over 4 hours. The majority of people who do this ionophoresis don't typically get the same symptoms that you would get with the NAD. And if they do, it tends to be much, much lower intensity. You know, usually it's the same type of symptoms. People who get the GI distress with the IVs might get GI distress with the patch, but it seems to be at a much, much lower level. And so usually this is done 2 times a week, sold in packs of 6, and is usually done for 3 to 6 weeks, and has been relatively popular for us recently. One of the last ones I want to talk about, and this is one that doesn't have a lot of clinical literature, but it does have 2 great studies. This is the Epicatechin. The Epicatechin is a polyphenol, which is usually found in green tea or dark chocolate, but whenever given to humans in high concentrations, particularly orally, can have some really good effects as it relates to muscle tissue. Here I show a study which shows the improvement of skeletal muscle mass and plasma levels of follistatin and myostatin with 8-week resistance training or strength training, as well as epicatechin supplementation. And the results of the study showed that both combining resistance training or strength training with epicatechin was able to add the most lean muscle mass, which is obviously helpful for patients as they age who are sarcopenic, or anyone wanting to sort of maximize their metabolic currency. This is another study which shows that you had increased bilateral hand strength increases of around 7% in 7 days, which obviously is another sign that this isn't just adding lean muscle mass, but it's also contributing to functional benefit through this ergogenic benefit of increased strength. And this is typically dosed at 500 milligrams twice daily. And so that sort of concludes the new products that we wanted to highlight. Obviously, some of the other newer products, such as the ARA 290 and the FOXO4 DRI, which have been relatively unavailable, are going to become much more available here soon. And we'd love to answer your questions about those too as we sort of open this up. And so just to reiterate, we definitely focus a lot on the mitochondrial dysfunction of aging, and maybe one way to fix that, as well as sort of supplementing with the NAD. And so with that, I would really like to take any questions that anyone might have, and maybe go from there.
Yes, hello.
Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble pulling up the chat at the moment. My apologies. It's looking like I'm having a little bit of difficulty um, pulling up the chat. So what I will do is, once again, as always, I'm always available via email at rs@tailormadehealth.com. Feel free to always email me with any questions. I'd be happy to get back to you. We also will, as usual, be posting these slides, as well as a link to all the clinical literature surrounding this product, the SS31, and what we do have on the NAD and epicatechin as well. And thank you again for attending. And if there's anything else I can do, please email me at rs@tailormadehealth.com. Thank you so much.